there was even some humiliation and vulnerability. And it was like, I had been like, I'm surrounded by nurses and I'm invisible. They can't help me.
This is NICU Babies Parent Support with Kathryn Whitaker, a podcast from Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit that provides free personalized support, resources, and community before, during, and after a NICU stay. My conversations here focus on education and personal stories with medical and hospital professionals, counselors, therapists, and NICU moms and dads from across the country. So whether you're preparing for a NICU stay, you're currently there, or you're months and years past your stay, you belong here. The NICU is hard. We're here to help. I'm your host, Kathryn Whitaker, the mom of 6 children, including my very own NICU baby, and I'm so grateful that you're here. Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the podcast. I cannot believe that this is our very last episode of this amazing season of tending the heart, the body, and the home. I knew that there would be someone that would be able to tie it all together, and that is my guest today. It's Casey Davis. You know, there are a lot of us who have children in the NICU, and we find ourselves feeling very isolated. And many times, oftentimes, we turn to our friends, our family, and we also turn to social media. Maybe it's for solidarity, maybe it's for community, maybe it's just to share our story, to invite people into that. And we have this tricky relationship, shall I say, with social media. And as our NICU babies grow up into NICU tweens and teens and young adults, sometimes we wonder, did we share too much? Should we have shared that differently? Was it my story to tell? And so that is what Casey and I are going to really dive in deep today and talk about, how does social media affect our kids? How do we find good boundaries as parents? And what does it all mean? How do we do it well? And also recognize our own fallibilities as human beings, that we are probably feeling in a very chaotic, out of control environment. And so what does that look like? So my guest today is Casey Davis. Her compassionate and practical approach to self and home care for those dealing with mental health, physical illness, and hard seasons of life has drawn over 1 million followers on social media in less than a year. Her book, How to Keep House While Drowning, has sold over 70,000 copies and is currently on Amazon's bestseller list. Casey Davis began her therapy journey at age 16 when she entered treatment for drug addiction and mental health issues. After getting sober, she became a speaker and an advocate for mental health and recovery. Professionally, Casey has worked most of her career in the field of addiction in roles such as a therapist, consultant, and executive director. She lives in Houston with her husband and 2 daughters. And so with that, let's chat social media. Well, I'm excited to have a fellow Texan, but also someone who speaks a lot about mental health and just all the things I think that a lot of NICU moms, whether you were in the NICU or not, can certainly relate to. Casey, thanks for being here.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Well, you have an impressive following on social media, but I want to back up all the way. We'll get to the social media stuff in a minute, but I'm curious, what led you to seek out a career in counseling? And then how did you take that experience in counseling and start to transition that and start sharing it in social media? So we'll start first with, how did you get into counseling? And second, when did you start sharing it publicly?
So I got sober from a drug addiction when I was like 16. I was sent away to teen rehab. I was there for 18 months. And then when I got out of there, I stayed in therapy and did support groups and all of that, and really just took my personal growth really seriously, because I felt like that was kind of the key to maintaining my sobriety at the time. Well, and I still think that. So I was working as a lay person with other people struggling through addiction, and finished up college and decided to go to grad school. And I actually originally was majoring in theology, and then kind of looked up one day and was like, I'm basically doing lay counseling at these places where I'm volunteering. And I was even working as a tech at a treatment center. So I decided to kind of switch gears into counseling. And that's how I ended up with my graduate degree in counseling and pursuing counseling as a professional path. And I worked in addiction mostly up until the birth of my second kid.
Certainly, you saw what it looked like as the beneficiary of counseling, and then you got to be on the other side. How did that feel? Like, do you think that helped when you were on the other side?
Yeah. So it's an interesting question, right? Because I don't know if you guys are familiar, but they just came out with a documentary on Netflix called The Program,
Yeah.
which is about teen rehabs. And so I went to a teen rehab. There was no like abuse necessarily happening where I went, but the culture of teen rehab is very, very harsh, very psychologically, a lot of coercion and pressure and social. And very much there's a line in there where it says they break you down in order to build you back up. And the process of breaking someone down is traumatic. It doesn't matter if you have good motives or if you think it's going to save their life. It doesn't matter if it does save their life. Like, it is traumatic, and it very much wounds you well into adulthood. And so it's interesting because there were a part of going through that process that I feel like made me a really, really good counselor because I understood what it was like to be in that seat. And then there was a part of it where, you have like blinders. It's like, well, this is what I went through, so this must be the best way. And it took me several years into my career to start to kind of take those blinders off and go, oh, I've just been kind of like repeating the therapy that I received instead of taking a step outside of my own experience. It's like the experience is really helpful to know what it's like to be a client, to know what works from your side of the street, but everyone is different. And you also have to step outside of your experience. Sometimes it can be a detriment to feel like, well, because this worked with me, it must work with everyone. And to see people and kind of widen your view about what therapy is and what it can be.
I just had this conversation. We have another podcast really focused on NICU professionals. And I was speaking to a chaplain, and we were talking about grief. And he said, I thought I knew what it was in this box, but he said, with every new person I encounter, I destroy more and more of the sides of the box, which this sounds very similar in that stepping outside of your own experience and allowing yourself to look at someone's own unique situation, and then how can you help them. It has to be, well, I mean, it has to be an opportunity for growth, but also an opportunity to be like, hey, there's a lot of people dealing with a lot of different things in the world. So when did you start? So you had this experience going through counseling, then you started counseling. How and when did you decide to be like, hey, maybe I should share this on social media, like with the bigger world? And
It was an accident.
I find that fascinating. Well, that's
It was
mostly
a
what people say.
total
It's an accident.
Yeah. So I had quit working full time when I had my first kid, but I was doing like monthly like workshops. And then when I had my second baby, I quit that altogether. And I was like, okay, now it's full stay-at-home mom without even any side gigs. And probably 3 weeks after I had my second baby was when the lockdown happened for the pandemic. And all of these supports that I had in place for myself as a mom, as a new mom, right? Of, meals and friends and play dates and cleaners and daycare and all these kind of things, like all of a sudden they went away overnight. And, and of course the whole thing kicked off with a 3-day NICU stay for my younger daughter. And the other one hadn't even turned 2 yet. And so suddenly like I had nothing and I was drowning, and I didn't even realize I was drowning because I had postpartum depression that did not present as sadness. It presented as anger and numbness. So I was kind of just like going through the motions. And the way that I put it was like, my husband had just started a new job, and he was a job as a corporate attorney. And so, I mean, he was working 7 days a week, and that like, those early stages of those really demanding careers, like if anyone is married to like a doctor or a corporate lawyer, any of those, like,
it's brutal.
It's hard in those first years. And I remember one day expressing to a friend, like I get through the day, just like trying to get to the end of the day. And then the end of the day comes, and I know my work isn't done because there's going to be several times overnight that I still have to do this. And every night when I go to bed and I think about the next day, I feel like I'm looking down the barrel of a shotgun. Like there was no, oh, thank God the day's over, or like, ooh, tomorrow is Saturday, or any of that. Like we don't even realize that we take these small moments of relief and optimism and anticipation every day that the day is over, whether you're thinking about, well, tomorrow's Friday, or well, in 3 days, it's the weekend, or, well, I have vacation next week. There was just, I would look out to this like nothingness, just day after day after day after day after day of the same thing. And every day was hard and every day was draining and there was no end in sight.
And so what did you do?
So my sister actually convinced me to get on TikTok because she thought it'd make me laugh. Like she started sending me TikToks and she's like, this will make you laugh. This will make you laugh. You got to get on TikTok. It'll make you laugh. So I did. And I posted a video here or there. And then one video that I posted was kind of like a joke about how messy my house is. And that kind of got a lot of traction. And I was like, oh, how interesting. Like whenever I posted about my house being messy, and posted one about like, look at all the things that aren't going to get done today. And somebody commented on it that I was lazy. And I remember just being like, I don't know. I don't have anything else in me to give. And here's this person telling me I'm not doing enough, right? Because there's dishes in the sink and there's books on the floor and all this stuff. And so I started pushing back against that. And I started posting more videos of me cleaning, and people started commenting. Yeah, there were people that would say, oh, you're lazy, or, oh, I had 9 kids and postpartum depression and I still was able to keep a clean house. But there were a lot of more people that resonated that said like, I feel so much shame that my house is so messy and everybody else seems to have it together. And I really appreciate that you're showing that you don't have it together. And I think that's when, like, even though I wasn't intending to like make videos about mental health content, like the therapist in me like took the bait. You know what I mean? Like I couldn't help but reach out to somebody, these people that were saying that they were also in pain. Yes. And say like, you're not failing. Like this is really hard and you're not failing. And so that's when the videos kind of took a turn to like, hey, here are some little tips and tricks and hacks about cleaning that I've done my whole life because I've never been very good at cleaning, along with sort of the therapeutic side of me of like, these tasks are morally neutral. You're not failing if this is hard.
You said something in your TED Talk, which I rewatched the other day. I didn't find you until well past the pandemic, and everyone was like, surely you know about Casey. And I was like, how do I not know about her? But it was something that you said in the video that resonated deeply with me. So I'm a mom of 6, pretty top A, like, I don't think I ever saw household tasks as morally neutral. I saw them as if I'm not doing them, then I'm either a good person or a bad person, depending upon the day. But you said something in there. You said switching the conversation from I'm failing to I'm just having a really hard time right now. Mm-hmm. Maybe speak into that a little bit for people because I think there's a lot of NICU moms, Casey, that feel like, one, they are drowning, and then maybe they've had something happen with their baby and they feel like maybe they think it's their fault. 99.9% of the time it's not, but that's the way we feel. And so then you add in all the chaos and we go from I'm failing, I can't do this right. So maybe speak into that, I think, for some of those moms who may be struggling with that.
Yeah, I think we somewhere along the way got conflated in our minds that housekeeping is the same thing as motherhood. And it's not. And so we have this, feeling like if we're not good at housekeeping, or if the house doesn't look a certain way, or if we're not, quote unquote, keeping up with all these things. And of course, we don't have reasonable expectations. Like one of the other things I say is like when I became a stay-at-home mom, I signed up to make sure that everybody in my house always had clean clothes. I did not sign up to make sure that nobody never had dirty clothes. Right? Like my job is to make sure that everybody always has clean dishes to eat off of, not that there are never dirty dishes. And we have this idea that there's this binary of things are done or they're not done. And we have to get everything done and keep it at done. And we feel a lot of anxiety when it's not done. And we feel like, and that's all most people represent online. You go to someone's house, they've cleaned before you get there. You watch videos and people have pushed things to the side before they made that video. And people make these overly romanticized videos about motherhood and keeping house and this Instagram aesthetic. And we all had that vision of motherhood, or maybe not all of us, but I sure did. I thought I was going to be leaning back in the rocking chair, breastfeeding as, daylight tinkled in from the shades, and it was going to be so peaceful. And like, that's not what it was. It was me walking by my shame pile of laundry every day, because although I could get the laundry done, it just like then lived in a dry, clean, wrinkled pile on the floor. And I tossed through it every day to find clothes for everybody. And we feel like we're failing. But the truth is that I do not believe laziness exists. As a therapist, and I've talked to other therapists about this, like anytime we've worked with a client that presents as quote unquote lazy, once you get down to the bottom of what's going on with them, it's almost never a moral issue.
Right.
You will occasionally find like an entitlement issue, almost always with a man who's living with a woman, right? So there's this unequal division of household labor, but that's not laziness, that's entitlement and exploitation.
Right.
Mostly what you find are these very legitimate barriers of mental health issues and executive dysfunction issues and being overwhelmed and being burnt out and not having enough support and having too high of expectations for ourselves. And it's not a moral failing. It's not a character defect. We have this idea that everybody else is pulling this off but us. So there must be something wrong with us.
Yes.
And that shame is so deep. And then we think, well, if we just berate ourselves harder, we'll motivate ourselves to get up and do more. But it doesn't work that way. Like nobody has ever shamed themselves into better functioning.
Shame is a horrible way to make better choices in your life. It never works. It reminds me, I mean, it took me 5 kids. I remember one day I was sitting on the couch and I looked at my husband. I said, I think I'm just going to have a lazy day. And he looked at me and he said, no, Kathryn, you're going to take care of yourself. You're not being like, look around.
Mm-hmm.
You birthed all these babies and we're doing the best that we can. And it's okay to not do the dishes or to ask, if someone offers help for you to receive that help, which is, I think, really hard to do. And I was so glad that he said that. I needed him to say that to me for me to believe it. And so maybe someone listening maybe needs to hear that too, that you're not being lazy. You just need a minute. Like you said,
Yeah.
it's a little bit hard right now.
Well, that's what the world really wants to tell us. Like I did a TikTok recently about how we've really emphasized independent play for our kids. They're 4 and 6 now. And part of that is that like I've completely withdrawn myself from the role of pretend playmate, which means that I just say no. Every single time I'm asked to play pretend, I say no. And I say it kindly and graciously. And I make sure that there are lots of other very fulfilling ways that we're interacting. But that's just one role that I have extricated myself from that has freed up so much time and space for me. And if I use that time and space to do the dishes, people aren't really that angry with me. But in my TikTok, I said, I'm using that time and space to read a book I really like. And people just came out of the woodwork about what a horrible, lazy mother I was. Why did you even have kids if you don't want to play with them? I mean, just all of this messaging that society likes to put on mothers, that we are the ones that are to be endlessly self-sacrificial and to ask anyone else in your family, whether that is your children or your partner or your damn dog, to sacrifice something or to be uncomfortable or to have their own limits or to, not get everything they want from you at all times is just like heresy.
No, I just had this conversation with one of my kids the other day. So we've got 3, 4 teenagers, a bunch of teenagers. Anyway, one of my teenagers said to me, why did you say no, Mom? And I said, because I can't say yes every time because that doesn't show you how to put in good boundaries. I said, we
Yeah.
have to learn to say no because if I say yes all the time, then why even have me? You just do whatever it is that you want, right? But I think that there are lots of families, Casey, who feel like there's a certain way, maybe in this case, like there's a certain way to raise a NICU baby or a certain way to have a NICU kid. And if you don't do it the checklist way, that somehow you're failing, you're not doing it right. So,
Well, and here's the thing, like when you get to like the 4 and 6-year-olds, you can talk about reclaiming that time and space from play. When you get to the teenagers, you can talk about reclaiming that space from, no, I'm not going to drive you there, whatever. But when they're little babies, the only way to reclaim some of that time and space are ways that we feel so even more ashamed of. There are ways about like quitting breastfeeding.
right.
Or ways about what if I did daycare 2 days a week, even though I'm a stay-at-home mom? What if I just use paper plates for the next year? right? It's those sort of ones that we feel all of this, like that's real failure, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I always just want to tell moms, like, look around, where else are you going to get it? Like, what's the plan, guys? Is the plan we just burn out until we have
Right.
nothing to give mentally and emotionally? Because that's what happens. Our society is not really set up to take care of moms, and especially not to take care of moms that have NICU babies or moms that have disabled children.
Yeah. What are we teaching our kids if not now?
Mhm.
Like, it's never too early, I think, to employ a lot of those things. I mean, I know you have some good resources. We're going to talk about those. This podcast is produced by Hand to Hold, a national nonprofit, but we're more than simply a podcast. Be sure to download our app in the Apple Store or on Google Play, or you can visit our website to discover all the ways that we can support you as a NICU parent at handtohold.org. You can join one of our support groups, sign up for counseling, find loss and bereavement support, request a peer mentor, or check out our educational resources and family stories. And all of that is at no cost to you. So I'm going to back up. So our NICU baby was in the NICU back in 2009, which Facebook was kind of around and Instagram was like a photo editing app. Fast forward to, the next baby and it was 2014. But back in 2009, and I think the culture now is like when something happens to your family, our default is to go to social media. One, to maybe find solidarity. I know I found a lot of moms with hashtags or other things. And then also to maybe invite people in to your suffering. Maybe they can help your family, love your family, whatever. So I guess, how do you, or what would you suggest when a family starts to say, hey, I want to share this online, but also having some good boundaries of like, okay, so this maybe is good to share, but this is where we get into tricky, like if your kid Googles this in 10 years, how are they going to feel about it kind of thing. So maybe
Yeah.
we'll talk about your series in a minute that you just did on your podcast, but maybe give people a sense of a little bit of that struggle. Because I think the intentions may start out good, but somewhere along
Yeah.
the lines, maybe they don't.
Yeah. I think it's hard because, again, we want to tell our stories. We don't want to tell someone else's story, but there's this big overlap when you're a mom and probably even a parent in general. But societally speaking, really moms, where it's like, my story is their story and their story is my story. And so, like, how do I share in a way that is authentic and okay while thinking about what piece of this is mine to share and how will my child look back on pieces of their story that got shared online to who knows who, right? Like putting aside
Right.
some of the safety issues about like, I don't want people knowing identifying information about my child. I don't want them knowing, in what ways my child is vulnerable or where they go to school or what they look like or any of that. Just looking at, how are my children going to think about this looking back? And as someone who went through a teen rehab program that experienced a lot of loss of autonomy, I know how damaging it could be to feel like you don't have control, to feel like you've lost that autonomy over your story, I think would be just as traumatic. And so I don't have any like hard and fast rules for me. It's just sort of like something that I try. Like I've talked about the fact that one of my children has autism. I've talked about what it's like to a degree parenting an autistic child, but I also share that in a way where I'm constantly thinking about she will hear this one day.
Mhm.
And I feel confident that sharing the fact that I have an autistic child is, not a bridge too far. And yet there are steps beyond that when it comes to her identity or her medical information that I don't feel is mine to share. And so it's kind of a balancing act of this is a really big part of me. And I also think it's what am I sharing and why, right? Am I looking for
Right.
something in a public response because I am open and raw and wounded? Or have I taken that open, raw wound to a safer container where I can really be myself and get good feedback and just bleh, write the whole thing, the hard stuff, the bad stuff, the thoughts we don't want to tell anybody. And then have I, so that I can go to what could potentially be a bigger platform and share more thoughtfully about, am I helping someone? Am I connecting with people? Am I building community? And I think that's the bigger thing to think about, especially because for me, I'm 37 and my whole experience, it's social media has been around since I was in college, high school even, but it was always a closed loop, right? Like Facebook and Instagram were your friends and acquaintances. And what I see a lot of moms do is that they're sharing on places like TikTok or now Instagram, like Reels, like they're sharing on those platforms as if it was old school Facebook.
Yeah.
Not recognizing that this isn't just going to Aunt Sally and that lady you work with and maybe the person that you went to high school with. Like these are going to complete strangers all around the world.
Right.
And so I think that those are some of the things that I think about when I'm referencing my children online.
Yeah, you bring up a good perspective is that we don't go to social media to be healed. It's important that we process. I think I call it like the strainer, right? Like we have this raw emotion and we put it through the strainer and then we're like, okay, what gets strained out and what is it that I share? Like our son recently had another surgery and he asked, Mom, please don't share it. You can tell people that I'm having surgery, but please don't share any details. He's 14 now. And I said, that's fair, and I said, because you're old enough to make decisions like that, if we want to share or not share. And I think that it's hard, Casey. I would say that like in the early days of the NICU, I think I go back now and like that was back in the blogging days, and I've since taken a bunch of that stuff down. I know it lives forever on the internet, but some of that stuff I took down because I was like, man, I was processing some stuff. I was new at it, still trying to figure some stuff out, and now that needs to come down. It's a little trickier now with the instant I guess the instant nature of both TikTok and Instagram and all the other places that it becomes a little tricky. So on your podcast recently, you did, which I found absolutely fascinating, I have to say. So you did a two-part series on family vlogging and this epidemic, I guess, pandemic of sharenting and when it goes way too far. So maybe share because it was shocking and I mean it shouldn't have been shocking and eye-opening for me, but it made me rethink a lot of things. So maybe tell people a little bit about that series and what some of the high points.
Yeah. So my podcast is called Struggle Care. And for one of those episodes, I interviewed a woman who's now an adult who her mom was like one of the original mommy bloggers and would blog about her life and her experience and specifically about her medical things that she was going through. And she talks about, this awareness that, she's trying to have a conversation with her mom and she's like, is this going to end up on her blog?
Mm.
She talks about how, her mom would share details online and then like people would show up to the hospital. She talks about, strangers recognizing her in public and making comments to her. And she especially talks about the effect that that has on her now as an adult. Like she finds it difficult to get close to people. She finds it difficult to be vulnerable with people because her whole childhood, there was no safe container. And now it's hard to get close to people because what's going to happen to that vulnerable information I give them? And it was really hard to listen to, but I think it's important.
Yeah. It was hard to listen to, but I think it brings up this bigger, I think we're just really a few years into people sharing a lot of things online. We don't have a lot of data. The data that we're seeing is confirming what we already know, but like long term, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, we don't know yet. And I think it does, and I think it should give all of us a little bit of pause as to why. I think asking your question of why am I sharing this and what's the end result? Like am I wanting to find, other moms maybe who have the same medical condition that one of my kids has, or because I'm feeling lost and alone and I need, some community, or am I trying to make money? Like what are the things that people are doing on the internet? So I think that comes with some lessons. So, Casey, what would be your suggestion or your advice to people if someone looks at that and says, "Okay, I may have shared too much." How do you walk that back?
I think that you can always take things down. We know that the internet's forever, but mostly the average person thinking this is going to be able to walk it back without too much ripple effect. Like you can make your Facebooks private. You can take down TikToks with your kids in them that you feel like is maybe too much. And all we can do is the best that we know going forward. Like, this is just another area of parenting. Unfortunately, like, we're kind of like the first parents to have to figure it out. So we can't look to anybody older to tell us how they did it. But it's just like every other thing. I mean, we're all kind of doing this for the first time, and all we can do is our best to protect our kids' privacy and autonomy, and change what we're doing going forward.
What are some things, Casey, that you do when it comes to, I know you talked a little bit about one of your kids having autism. How do you decide what to share, what not to share? Like, where do you draw that line for you personally? I'm thinking about maybe parents, like I have a great friend, her son received a heart transplant, and she's been really open and honest about that. It's been really helpful for me, and I think, to learn about the transplant process, and I think she's doing it well. But what would be your suggestion, I guess, to people that are trying to share something, but they don't want to share too much? I guess give
Sure.
people some things, like some rubrics that you might use.
So when I talk about like the diagnosis process, I will talk about how, I was the first one in my family to notice that there was something going on, about how, I really pushed it, about how it was hard for me to find a provider that would take me seriously. I talked about how, the industry at large is really used to seeing boys that are, level 3. I talk about how we finally found someone and what the differences were. I talked about my feelings on therapies. I talk about, my experience going through it, but I don't share like anecdotes about my kids. I maybe a handful of times have shared like something funny that they say, and in my head, there's like this category of the funny things your kids say that are like, it's like a thing any kid could have said, right? Like,
Right.
one time, my younger one walked up to me and said, "Hi, Papa." And I was like, "What?" She goes, "Hi, Papa." And I was like, I don't understand. Hi, Papa. And she got so frustrated. And then my older daughter, who was drinking a glass of milk at the time, like, pulled the milk off of her face, and there was like a big milk mustache, and she went, "She wants you to move the Paw Patrol tower upstairs, Mom." And like, it's such a ubiquitous experience of like having a hard time understanding a young toddler. And it's kind of funny that like, they understand it. To me, that is like a completely different type of story to share. That is almost so ubiquitous and non-identifying and non-personal. And even then I don't share a ton of those, but that's very different than, you know, sharing a mistake that my child made, which I might think is so funny because we're adults and kids make mistakes, but they may not think that. Then sharing a medical procedure or something that they're struggling with, or anything about potty training or any of that, like anything that is personalized, that isn't just like, oh, how funny the random everyday child sometimes is, right? So yeah, I mean, and then one time, I made a video where I was kind of making light of the fact that people would sometimes say like, "Oh, your kid doesn't look autistic." But then there's all of these, like, if you know about autism, there are these little traits, like there's this, like, it's called finger dancing, finger tapping, or walking on their toe, whatever. But then I made the video of me doing that. I was like, finger tapping and walking on toes. And again, those are universal autism traits.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, this isn't sharing like a super specific thing about my child. It's not sharing anything about what she says or does. Like, it's just, if you know my child has autism, it wouldn't be, you know, much more information to be like, oh yeah, finger tapping and walking on toes. So those are some examples.
Those were excellent. I mean, I'm thinking about, things that we shared, or things that we walked back, that, like, I had a kid call me out, "Mom, why did you share that?" And I was like, "You know what? I thought it was a pretty innocuous thing that I shared, but I recognize maybe that was something that might be a little tender for you. So, you know what?" So, I think, I guess the bigger lesson is that, certainly as my kids have gotten older, as I've been able to say, "You know what? I messed up. We shouldn't have done that. We're going to fix it, and we're going to just move forward." That I don't expect, I think, NICU parents, or really any parent, to do it perfectly. We're all trying, like you said, we're all trying to figure it out, and what is the good boundary, what's not the good boundary. But I think those are some really good suggestions of still being able to find the community, I think, that we desire. That's been the beautiful part of social media, is that
Yeah.
it has allowed me to connect with people, Casey, that I would have never found, never been blessed by their wisdom had it not been for that. But I think that there's always a line that you say, okay, this is too far and let's not go that far.
I would share a lot about that moment of like, I'd been discharged, but she hadn't. And so like they had let me like rent a room basically, but you couldn't get anything. You couldn't even get Advil. And I didn't bring enough clothes because I didn't think I was going to be there that long. And so I had to be out of the room by 8 a.m. every day because you could only get a room at night if like there were rooms available. And so every day.
It's like a really bad hotel, right?
Yeah, seriously. But I'm in like a robe and slippers, and everything I owned was in a backpack. And I would walk from where I was staying to the NICU, and I would sit with my baby, and then I'd have to get up and go to the bathroom across the hall, the public bathroom across the hall, to like change my diaper. And I wasn't eating because I was too embarrassed to go to the cafeteria in slippers and a robe with a backpack and a diaper. And, my husband was coming back and forth because we had another daughter, and like just that sadness, and even like there was even some humiliation and vulnerability. And it was like, I had been like, I'm surrounded by nurses and I'm invisible. They can't help me. And I still need help, and I can't go home. And I like that moment is powerful, and it connects and it creates that community. And I haven't shared anything about my kid except that they were in the NICU.
It was a beautiful example of how to do it well. I think that we all just want to be seen in the isolation and in the alone, whether it's in the NICU or whether it's cleaning your kitchen or playing with your kids. I mean, I think that we all need to be seen. And I think maybe that's a good place for us to start, is where can we feel seen, and then what feels appropriate and right after that. Casey, I know you have a ton of resources for moms and really any caregiver who is feeling slightly overwhelmed. So maybe why don't you share what some of those resources might be for people?
Yeah. So I have a book called How to Keep House While Drowning, a gentle guide to cleaning and organizing, that has a lot of tips and tools, not just about cleaning, but about feeding yourself and getting your laundry done, and all the things that we need to do to care for ourselves when we feel like the world's falling down around us. I do have a podcast called Struggle Care. I have a website called Struggle Care, and you can follow me on social media too. I'm Struggle Care on Instagram and Facebook, where I post mostly like cool tips. And then if you just want a little peek into my life, I do a lot of that over on TikTok at Domestic Blisters.
You're an amazing resource, Casey, for people. While I'm not grateful that you spent time in the NICU, none of us wants to spend time in the NICU, or that things were difficult, but I'm grateful that instead of just dealing with that on your own, that you healed and did the hard work personally, but then you turned around and you said, I think this might be able to help some other people, even if it came by accident. I know that that you tend to be a real great gift for so many people. So thanks for joining us. Well, and just like that, season 7, it's a wrap. That's hard to believe. I hope that y'all have enjoyed this Tending the Body, Heart, and Home series, which I have really, really loved recording and talking to all these people. I can't think of a better guest to really wrap it all up than Casey. I think in today's 2-minute take, there's a couple things that she said that I think are not only worth mentioning again, but she gave me some stuff to think about. So I like that strainer approach, right? So has this really hard thing that's happened to our family, have we put it through the strainer? Have we word vomited emotionally, all the things with real life people in our life? And then have we taken and synthesized out the most important parts, the shareable parts, and put those on social media or share those in a public space? That I think that reminder that the rawness of the experience that you feel does not have to be shared in totality in order for people to love you, support you, and help you, right? So I know that there are many parts of our NICU stay that I only shared with my husband and that I only shared with our marriage therapist. They did not appear in my book. They do not appear on this podcast. They don't even come up in conversation with other people because they are too private and too sacred. And so knowing what that is for your family, and then what feels good for you to share in a public space. Also knowing that, I think Casey mentioned it well, and she shared it well, is that there's this overlap, right? Where their story doesn't really end and yours begin and vice versa. There's so much overlap. And so being able to extract the things that make sense for other people to know and keeping private those things that should be held private. I thought her example of sharing about the diagnosis of autism and how do you share that without sort of infringing on the rights of your kids, on their story, but yet still finding, I think, the solidarity in the community that so many of us who find ourselves in the NICU are really, really craving. The other part was, what's your why? Like, why are you sharing this in a public forum? So let's say in this case, social media, blogs aren't around anymore, are they? But what I'm saying is this, what's your why? Are you doing it because you want to find another mom who has a kid who has the same medical diagnosis that you do? Do you have this medical billing issue that you're like, if I just had someone that had been through this thing, maybe they could help. If someone had received this service from the government, maybe they could give me some insight, and then we can talk offline about some of the details. So I think, what's your why? What's your motivation? And really asking yourself, is that why compelling enough for you to share it on social media? So I know that this balance of sharing, not sharing on social media, your kid's story, your story, can be a very delicate balance. And no one's expecting you to do it perfectly. You can certainly, we talked about walking things back, but I was really grateful for Casey's wisdom and real life experience. If you haven't had a chance to go listen to her TED Talk, I would encourage you to do that. I think it gives you a good frame of reference as to where she's coming from, but also, and maybe giving yourself permission to let go of some things that you thought were super important, and maybe they're not quite as important as you thought as you're finding yourself in this really chaotic environment. If y'all have loved this season as much as I have, please do me a favor and go rate it over on Apple Podcasts or on Spotify. Please share the podcast with a friend, whether it's the listening version, so whether it's the audio version or whether it's the YouTube version. We're over on there as well. But we have an amazing one more season because there's still time in the year left, y'all. I can't leave you hanging. So we have one more season that's coming in a couple of weeks. So make sure that you tune in. I really think that you're going to love it. They just continue to have, there's just so many things to talk about, right? And so many guests that have so many perspectives that I keep wanting you to hear. I keep finding amazing people. And so here we are, one more season. So listen to us, share the podcast, and come back in a couple of weeks for season number 8. Until then, I'll see y'all next time.